Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about biology, or specifically anatomy and physiology. Now, the first thing you might want to ask is what is anatomy and physiology? So when we're talking about biology in the sense in the division of anatomy and physiology, anatomy means the structure of things, whereas physiology means basically how things are moving in the body. So, an example of this is to say, let's say, anatomy will be something like memorizing the name. Let's say you want to know what the skull is called. Well, the skull is called the skull, but it's composed of the cranium and the mandible. Whereas physiology would be something more saying, what makes the skull the skull? What are the things in the body that maintain sort of some concepts such as homeostasis and allostasis? Now, I'll talk about that later, but the idea is that physiology is understanding how your body is regulating on a 24/7 basis. So now let's jump into these ideas first with this idea that I've just mentioned of two things, homeostasis and allostasis. Now, homeostasis refers to basically your body trying to maintain a set internal environment. For example, let's say you're hot. Let's say it's a really hot summer day. There's the sun shining on you. Your body can't function with heat because when your body is too hot, you obviously, well, you first will get feverish. Your muscles might swell. You might ha experience a lot of symptoms in your body, and all these are not good for you. And this is just a sign that your body is basically not functioning in the heat. So your body will sweat to try to cool it down. So homeostasis is to make a maintaining does a maintaining job of ensuring a stable internal environment. Whereas allostasis is a reaction to something. Allostasis is referring to your body's ability to adapt to a new set point to meet different physical conditions. So let's say initially you were here, but then you decide to do a hike, and now you're on this mountain. So because you're going on a mountain, there's going to be a difference in altitude. You might feel the air is lighter and such. And because of this, your body might make you breathe more. So to basically adjust for the environment conditions. So allostasis can be referred to as adjusting this new set condition. Now, importantly, another key idea is that with both allostasis and homeostasis, you can have something called a feedback loop. So a feedback loop is a loop where you have a sensor, an integrator, and an effector. And this functions like this loop, and it can go back again here. This loop functions for many things in your body. So for instance, for a lot of physiological functions. So for instance, let's say you sense that it's being hot, you sense heat. At the integrator goes to your brain, and then the effector tries to get rid of the heat by sweating. So the effector is going to be sweat glands. Another example could be, let's say you are, uh, let's say another example is actually bleeding. Let's say you have feel pain and you feel an injury. So perhaps then that'll be uh, pain, injury. What happens then is that the pain is sent perhaps to your brain. And because you sense that you might be losing blood, your brain might act on the heart or blood vessels. This way, the brain can tell the blood vessels to constrict in order to prevent blood loss, at least in the short term or in the long term. Now, understanding this concept, let's go into basic chemistry and cell biology. So there's many ways this is taught, usually in high school or university or whatnot. But the big idea is that cells, the basic living unit is a cell. Now, cells can divide into cell division, but they can also differentiate, meaning having different roles. This cell can be made from one stem cell. You can have cells that are supposed to be red blood cells to be to transport oxygen, or you can have white blood cells for immune responses. The point being is that these cells are able to have these sort of different functions relatively. A better example is that you can talk about tissues in the body. After cells are divided and differentiated into different roles, you can have cells become epithelial tissue. You can have them become muscle tissue. You can have them become nervous tissue, and you can also have them become connective tissue. Now, I'll expand on the sort of definitions of these in a bit, but one important thing is that you have to understand that the cell is usually undergoes a cycle. There's first, a majority of the cycle is an interphase, and then there's mitosis, where the cell divides. This is interphase. And during mitosis, it experiences cytokinesis, where it fully divides. So most of the time in the cell cycle, it's tightly regulated by genes and other factors, and they're spent in interphase, meaning they don't divide. However, if regulation is disrupted, let's say it's disrupted at this point, you might be able to see cell growth here, cell growth here, cell growth. And this can lead to what we call a tumor, or more scientifically called a neoplasm. And if this neoplasm or tumor experiences extra mutations, if it transmits into the bloodstream, then this becomes a cancer. So remember, you can have abnormal cell growth in the body in the case of a tumor or a neoplasm, but not necessarily will they all become cancers. Now, the other thing I want you to discuss or to think about is the idea of transport between a membrane. So let's say we have a cell membrane like this between two parts of the body. Cells need to give nutrients to just parts of the body, whether it's going from left to right or right to left. Now, you can have two processes. One is called a passive process. One is called an active process. Active processes need ATP, whereas passive processes don't need ATP. And the two types of passive processes are first is free diffusion. So just things moving downwards. Usually free diffusion and passive processes themselves refer to something called a concentration or electrochemical gradient. Another idea is actually called facilitated diffusion, where a channel molecule can help move down concentration gradient. So so how do I explain this better? Let's consider things like a dam, or yeah, let's call it a dam. So let's say there's more water on this side than on this side. Then obviously the water here is going to apply pressure to this dam and it's going to want to push through. This is what passive transport is about. When there's more of a certain electromagnetic gradient on one side, let's say this side's more positive than the other side. Intuitively, the positivity is gonna push through here. Now, in terms of, it's easier to think of it as concentration because let's say there's just more water here, then intuitively the water is going to want to break the dam and move to the right side. Then that's how passive processes work. We don't need ATP. We don't need energy to do so. But let's say we need this side with a less water to move over here because there's a drought experiencing on this site. Then when we would need something called active processes. Now, active processes, there's two ways. One is called primary active transport, And they directly use ATP using a pump. And using this pump, you're able to transport one thing to, sorry, transport one molecule from a site with very little of them to a site with many of them. Another form is called secondary active transport, where using ATP, you can shift the gradient of one molecule to the other side. And then using this concentration gradient, this powers a pump that moves something else on the other side. The best idea to imagine secondary active transport relative to primary active transport is that primary transports only one thing, whereas secondary is transporting two things in both opposite directions. Another form is called vesicular transport, where vesicles can transport small particles that diffuse onto the other side as well. And this can occur in one molecule at a time, multiple molecules at a time, etc. Now, remember what we said about different tissues, the muscle tissue, and whatnot. Let's get back into that. So we talked about how cells can divide and differentiate to different types. So let's talk about this. So there's going to be differences with all four types, but let's talk about it. So the first type of tissue that we can talk about is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is designed to contract and produce mechanical force. So imagine our muscles. We're able to make forces that way. Could be someone's arm. Imagine that's a bulging bicep. You're able to contract much and produce mechanical force. Now, connective tissue, they generally fill in or stiffen parts in your body. This could include bones. This could include fat. Nervous tissue is designed to send and receive signals, such as neurons. And epithelial tissue, they line parts of your body. Let's say your stomach lining and stuff. This is all parts of your epithelial tissue. Now, this also allows for physical protection, permeability, secretions, and whatnot. You should also know that for epithelial tissue, there's many kinds. Unlike muscle, connective, and nervous, which generally share characteristics, epithelial tissue can be, well, yeah, they can be, well, there's many kinds, but the main thing you should understand is that you can have one layer or multiple of epithelial tissue. Let's say you can have just one layer of cells like this, or you can just have like cells stacking up on each other. And with respect to this, you can be squamous epithelial, which means it's flat. So if you see squamous epithelial with multiple, it'll look kind of like scales, kind of like this. You're going to be cuboidal, which means they're in cubes. So they'll be like this. And you'll see kind of like a brick shape pattern if you see cuboidal in the multiple layers. You can also be columnar, which means you're in columns. And you can also be pseudostratified, which means that they look like they're multiple layers, but they can be kind of randomly mixed up like this. So the reason this is important is because we have something called an apical surface and a basolateral layer. So if you want to think of cells in the body, cells are lining the inside of a body. So let's say the inside is here. Cells are lined up into something called the basement membrane. And on top of these basic membrane, let's say outside of the cells here, they can have many functions, provide secretions and whatnot. Imagine like your skin. If you tear off your skin, there's got to be like skin cells that attach onto cells on your skin, right? So at the very bottom layer, it's called the basement membrane. And attaching onto the basement membrane is called a basolateral layer. And then you have the apical layer, and then the basolateral. So why is this important? Well, the apical layer is in contact with the lumen. The lumen refers to basically the inner lining of the body and is basically responsible for all the functions, whereas the basolateral layer is just inside of it. What this means is, let's say you're trying to digest food. Food would first make contact with the apical layer of the stomach, and then it will enter the basolateral layer and then enter the basement membrane. Well, it wouldn't be digested in the stomach, but the idea is still there. And what's important is that when you relate it back to the epithelium, you'll find that when you're in these these squamous layers, these squamous types, you'll have an apical surface wider than the lateral surface, or greater than lateral surface. And then you'll find here that the apical surface is less than lateral surface. So you can have this trade-off here. Now, what's also important is that between cells, you can have forms of transport. Let's say cells are lined like this, right? You can have paracellular transport or transcellular transport. Paracellular means you're transporting between cells. And then transcellular means you're transporting inside a cell. So let's talk about it. You can have leaky tight junctions. Leaky junctions allow for paracellular transport, whereas tight junctions don't allow for paracellular transport. What's important is that the reason, like whether or not you can have these sort of like transports greatly affects how basically let's say, basically it affects a lot about how the body works. For example, in the brain, you don't have ways of getting past with paracellular transport, and that's called the blood-brain barrier. And what that leads to is that drugs won't enter your brain as easily and such. So you also have the same thing with connective tissue. Well, not too related, but connective tissue, there's a rule that you can have connective tissue, and that is that connective tissue can have either a low density or high density of extracellular fibers. For example, what this means is like whether they're very thickly compact in connective tissue or they can be very loosely compact. So one example is, let's say, a tendon. A tendon is very thick. If you ever touched your tendon, you can probably feel some around your body. Your tendons are very strong and sturdy, and you can definitely feel that there's very dense packing of these fibers. Whereas areolar tissue is basically a form of connective tissue that separates essentially it's basically within collagen fibers. It's in your skin specifically. But you can feel just directly, if you touch your skin, you feel that's very less dense. Now, with density, you'll find that if it's less dense, you have more cell types. And then if it's greater in density, you'll have less cell types. Does this make sense? All right. There's a bunch of classifications you can also understand with connective tissue. But, let's just list some of these to make things easier. So for connective tissue, you can have basically connective tissue proper. You can have fluid connective tissue, or you can have supportive connective tissue. Now, for connective tissue proper, you can have loose or you can have dense. Fluid, you can either have blood or lymph. And then supportive, you can have cartilage or bone. Now let's go over the subtypes. So for loose, you can have areolar tissue, you can have adipose tissue, or you can have reticular tissue. And for dense, you can have dense, regular, dense, irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Here's the dense connective tissue proper. For cartilage, you can have hyaline cartilage, you can have elastic cartilage, or you can have fibro cartilage. These are just some general types. Uh, and let me see what else there is to do. Connective tissue also has two cell types that you need to know. They have fibroblasts and fibrocytes. Fibroblasts secrete proteins of the matrix, of the extracellular matrix. Fibrocytes maintain the proteins of connective tissue, and mesenchymal cells as well. These are stem cells that replace damaged fibroblasts, not fibrocytes, actually. Furthermore, you can also have different types. You also have some different types of protein in connective tissue proper. So in connective tissue proper, you have collagen fibers that supports tensile strength, and you can also have elastin fibers for elasticity. So yeah, uh, you also should know that epithelial tissue and connective tissue have different ways of healing. Epithelial tissue has rapid proliferation, whereas connective tissue leads to a matrix secretion. This leads to epithelial tissue making a clot, whereas connective tissue makes a scar because it forms a dense web of collagen fibers. Okay. I'll get to organ systems next talk, but this was fun, and I hope you enjoyed it today.